Welcome to our discussion about money. And this is a very important topic because if we're going to discuss banking and financial markets, you've got to understand the essence of money because money is the foundation in the banking sector and the financial markets. So, money uh, not only helps financial markets work, it also helps the broader economy work, the non-financial market works. The reason why is it helps make exchanges in an economy. In other words, it makes it easier to get things done. So, for example, workers are willing to accept money from firms in exchange for their labor. So, labor transactions are easy. And then, of course, firms are willing to accept the money from consumers in exchange for their goods and services. So, it helps you in the labor market, and it helps you in the product market. So, in other words, think of oil as the machine. Think of money as oil in the economic machinery. Without oil, the machine would not work as well. So, what we're going to do is we're going to basically define what money is. And money is anything that is generally accepted in payment for goods and services or the repayment of debts. That's a broad definition of money, and there are more narrow definitions of it also, but that kind of gets to the essence of what money is. And so money is different from wealth, for example. Wealth is basically an accumulation of assets, um, and it serves to store value of those assets. And income flows of is it basically a flow of earnings per unit of time worked. So in other words, you work to gain income, and income will accumulate into wealth. Now, wealth, income, and money are three different things. And so the idea of money, that's been around for a while. For example, China is one of the first societies to use money way back in 650 BC. And in Europe, we had the first paper money issued in Sweden way back in the 1600s. Now, if you don't have money, it makes it very difficult to transact. And if it's difficult to transact, that could lead to market failure. And so, if you don't have money, you have market failure. So, the question is, what could cause money to lose its usefulness? In other words, if you have money, what could cause it to be worth less and then therefore lead to market failure? Well, inflation. Inflation eats at the purchasing power of money. So if inflation is very, very high and increases rapidly, this means it takes greater and greater amounts of money to buy the same amount of, excuse me, to buy the same amount of goods and services. So money loses its purchasing power in the face of inflation. So inflation is basically just the average price level increase. So after all, $1 of, let's say, a Chinese currency, yuan, buys you half as much if the price level doubles. If prices double, your money, let's say your dollar, your yuan, your yen, your British pound, buys you half as much if prices double. So let's look at an example of runaway inflation that caused the money supply to collapse. The most egregious example of this is post World War I Germany. In the 1920s, the German economy saw the value of their currency, the mark, plummet in value. And the reason why is the Germans were on the losing end of World War I, and the victorious Allies demanded that the Germans repay uh, basically for damages for the war. And the German government simply printed more money, more marks, that was their currency, to pay for the war reparations. And it's a simple equation. If you flood the market with supply, the value of that good or service plummets. The same thing goes with money. If you print a lot of money, the purchasing power of that money will drop. And the German government printed so much that the value of the mark plummeted. And so, how much did it plummet? Well, each day it took more and more money to buy the same amount of goods and services in the German economy. Between May and June, so that's only 2 months in 1923, consumer prices quadrupled, doubling, tripling, then quadrupling in just 2 months. So, how bad did it get in 1923 when it comes to inflation? Prices were rising so rapidly, workers were paid 2 to 3 times a day just so they could take time off, buy goods and services before the prices went up. So throughout that year, 1923, inflation continued to skyrocket, and by November, a loaf of bread cost 140 billion marks. So think about that. If you're holding a 100 mark note and a loaf of bread costs 140 billion marks, that 100 mark note is worthless. So take a look at this. What do you see here? You see the exchange rate between the dollar and the mark. So in 1919, $1 bought 64 marks. Then over the course of 1, 2, 3, 4 years, $1 bought 64 marks in 1919, and in 1923, $1 bought 4.2 trillion marks. So that goes to show you that basically the mark by 1923 and a half, mid 1923, was basically worthless. And that was because of runaway inflation. We call it hyperinflation, by the way. So, when the money system breaks down, how do people transact? Well, basically, they barter, trade. But bartering is very, very inefficient. In order to barter, I need something that you have, and you must have something that I need in order to make a deal. And that could be very time consuming just to get things done. This is why barter economies are not very efficient. So, we've just established why money is important. In my next video, we're going to discuss exactly what money is.